Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey Herman and Corin. So we've seen the massive movement of US forces into the region in the past couple of weeks, and a quote from our episode about military colleges that sticks with me is that you said there's a refrain that amateurs talk tactics, experts talk logistics. And the US, by judging it by its actions in the past couple of weeks, is demonstrating an expert posture. It's focused very squarely on moving logistics into place. And we talked about the different parts of that puzzle. Everyone's looking at the F-16s and the jets crossing over the world, the flight trackers, etc. But we talked about the specific significance of more specialized parts of this movement of force, including the deployment of electronic warfare aircraft like the Boeing Growler to a base in Spain. And I'd love to talk in this podcast about one aspect of how this all works that I guess has always intrigued me, and that's the link between naval assets, airborne assets, and keeping them going to support maybe even ground assets. But if we just look at those two parts of the picture, we have aircraft carriers moving into the Middle East, which can, support, can carry service deployment bases for aircraft. We're also seeing big lifts of flights of aircraft and supplies over to forward positions. The US has this crazy global network of overseas air bases. And the question that I was actually going to ask in this podcast, in this episode, to be much more specific, was a simple one. If we have an important airborne asset like a surveillance or reconnaissance aircraft, is there a theoretical limit to how long that can be kept airborne? In other words, if we have a refueling capability, can we just keep refueling that plane and it can remain in place or in operation indefinitely? Or is there a point of time at which there's been enough refueling cycles that the plane has to return? It's just the cumulative wear on the parts, it needs a rest. And when I thought about that prompt, which was very specific, it got me thinking about, well, part of the operation from the US standpoint is not just getting the glamorous parts of their picture, the actual military jets in place. It's getting the refueling assets there. It's getting a supply of fuel. It's building the mobile supply chain that can keep all these assets going, whether we're talking about attacking or intelligence. And that's what I'd love to talk about in this episode of the podcast. Fighter jets need kerosene. Does the US, when it's moving all these moving parts into the region, have to literally move fuel depots? And if we talk about that concept of airborne refueling, where we have aircraft refueling one another, the refueler has to find a place to take off from and land, has to find a place to load its fuel capacity from in order to refuel the assets. So how does that work? Do these refueling tankers have to have? I presume they can't deploy from fighter jet carriers, so they have to deploy from fixed air bases. So what would the actual operational logic look like from the US's standpoint, where they're trying to we're getting the misleading picture from flight tracking that it's just a bunch of F-16s flying sorties or moving across the Atlantic to land somewhere and they're ready to take off and attack. But in reality, it's more like a network that's being deployed. It's the ultimate network in a box, to use that expression. Herman and Corin, let's chat about how it actually works, all the moving parts fit together to make this deployment ready to operate in today's episode of My Word Prompts.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn, and I am joined as always by my brother.
Herman Poppleberry here. It is good to be back in the studio, Corn. I have been glued to the screens this morning looking at the recent flight tracking data over the Eastern Mediterranean and the Red Sea. It is February 21st, 26, and the sheer density of hardware in the air right now is just staggering. If you look at the transponder signals, it is a literal wall of logistics.
It really is. It feels like the entire global apparatus of American power is being flexed in real time. We are seeing carrier strike groups, land-based tanker orbits, and constant surveillance loops. And that actually brings us right into today's prompt from Daniel. He was reflecting on something we talked about in a previous episode regarding military colleges, specifically that old refrain, amateurs talk tactics, but experts talk logistics. Daniel pointed out that the United States seems to be leaning into that expert posture right now, moving massive amounts of specialized gear like electronic warfare aircraft and carriers into position.
It is a great observation. We often see the F-35 or the F-22 in the headlines because they are the pointy end of the spear. They are fast, they are stealthy, and they look like the future. But the spear is only as good as the arm throwing it, and in this case, the arm is a multi-billion-dollar global web of tankers, maintenance crews, and supply lines. Without the logistics, those fighter jets are just very expensive statues sitting on a runway.
Exactly. And Daniel had a very specific question that I think hits on the core of this. He wants to know if there is a theoretical limit to how long a surveillance or reconnaissance aircraft can stay airborne. If you have infinite refueling capability, can a plane just stay up there forever? Or does the machine itself eventually just give up? And then, of course, how do you actually manage the mobile supply chain required to keep that whole circus running?
That is such a fascinating way to frame it. The short answer is no, you cannot stay up forever, but the reasons why are much more complex than just running out of gas. It is a battle between human biology, mechanical wear, and the chemistry of the fluids that keep these things moving. We are talking about a fight against entropy at 30,000 feet.
So let's start with the machine itself. If we assume we have a tanker plane following our surveillance craft around like a shadow, constantly topping off the tanks every few hours, what is the first thing to break? Is it the engine?
It is likely the oil. People forget that jet engines do not just burn fuel, they consume oil to keep those massive turbines spinning at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute. While a modern jet engine like the Pratt & Whitney F100 is incredibly efficient, it is not a perfectly closed system. There is a specific amount of oil on board, and over time, that oil either burns off, leaks through seals, or breaks down due to the extreme heat and shear forces. In a standard flight of 4 to 8 hours, you have plenty for the mission. But if you are talking about staying up for days or weeks, eventually those bearings are going to run dry, or the oil will become so contaminated with microscopic metal shavings that it loses its lubricating properties.
I never thought about that. You can refuel the kerosene mid-air, but I've never heard of a mid-air oil change.
Right? Imagine a little drone trying to fly up to the engine, cowling, unscrewing a cap, and swapping out a filter at 500 miles per hour. It just does not happen. So, the oil capacity is a hard mechanical limit. Then you have the hydraulic fluid. Every time the pilot moves a flap, or the landing gear cycles, or even just through the constant micro adjustments of the fly-by-wire system fighting turbulence, you have tiny, microscopic leaks. Over hundreds of hours, those add up. If you lose hydraulic pressure, you lose control of the plane. You are essentially flying a giant lawn dart at that point.
Okay, so the fluids are the first bottleneck. But what about the metal itself? We talk about airframe fatigue all the time. Does staying at a constant altitude at a constant speed actually wear the plane out faster than taking off and landing?
That is an interesting nuance. Taking off and landing are the most stressful parts of a flight for the airframe. The pressurization and depressurization cycles of the cabin are what really cause the metal to fatigue. Think of it like bending a paperclip back and forth. If you just leave the paperclip on the table, it stays strong. If you stay at altitude, you are maintaining a constant pressure differential between the inside and the outside, which is actually relatively easy on the structure compared to the cycle of going from sea level to 40,000 feet and back. However, the engines are still vibrating. The avionics are still generating massive amounts of heat. The cooling fans for the radar systems are still spinning. Every mechanical part has a mean time between failure, or MTBF. Statistically, if you stay up long enough, something critical, a fuel pump, a cooling fan, a sensor, will eventually snap or short circuit.
So even if the engine holds together, the radar might fry itself. But let's be honest, Herman, the machine is probably more durable than the person flying it, right?
Oh, by a long shot. The human element is the ultimate hard limit for manned aircraft. We have seen missions like the B-52 strikes during the Gulf War, or more recently with the B-2 Spirit bombers, where crews are in the air for 30, 40, even 44 hours straight. They fly from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, hit a target halfway around the world, and fly back. But those crews are absolutely miserable by the end. They are essentially zombies in flight suits.
44 hours in a cockpit sounds like a nightmare. How do they even manage that? I mean, physically, where do you sleep? Do they have a bunk?
In a B-2, there is a tiny space behind the seats, maybe the size of a yoga mat, where one person can curl up in a sleeping bag while the other flies. But you are talking about a space the size of a small closet shared by two people. And the noise is constant, a low-frequency hum that vibrates your very bones. The vibration is constant. You are eating dehydrated food and trying to stay hydrated without having to use the onboard piddle packs or the chemical toilet too often. The chemical toilet on a B-2 is basically a stainless steel bowl with a lid, and using it while wearing a flight suit in a cramped, vibrating cockpit is its own logistical disaster.
I remember reading about the U-2 spy planes, where the pilots are in full pressure suits like astronauts because they are flying so high that their blood would literally boil if the cabin depressurized. They have to eat out of tubes. You can't exactly stay in a pressure suit for a week.
Exactly. Decompression sickness is a real risk, as is simple cognitive decline. After 24 hours without sleep, your brain functions at the level of someone who is legally intoxicated. Even with the best training and some pharmacological assistance, the military has historically used things like modafinil or go pills to keep pilots alert. You eventually reach a point where you are a danger to the aircraft. You miss a signal, you miscalculate a refueling approach by 6 inches, and the mission ends in a catastrophe. The boom of the tanker hits your canopy instead of the fuel port, and suddenly you have a very bad day.
So, for a manned surveillance craft, the human is the weak link. But Daniel's prompt mentions things like the Boeing Growler, or these massive carriers moving into the region. That brings us to the second part of his question, the mobile supply chain. If the goal is to keep these assets operational near a conflict zone, how do you move the gas station to the neighborhood?
This is where it gets truly impressive. People see a carrier and they think of it as a floating runway, but it is actually a floating city and a floating warehouse. A carrier like the Gerald R. Ford carries millions of gallons of JP5 jet fuel. But even that runs out in a matter of days if the air wing is flying high-tempo operations. So you have these massive replenishment ships, the TAO class oilers, that meet the carrier at sea. They pull up alongside while moving at 15 knots, throw lines across, and pump hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel while both ships are tossing in the waves. It is a high-wire act of engineering called replenishment at sea, or RAS.
And that fuel has to come from somewhere before it gets to the oiler. It's not like there's a gas station in the middle of the Mediterranean.
Right. It is a literal chain. You have refineries in places like Greece or Italy or the United States. You have massive commercial-grade tankers moving it to regional hubs like Suda Bay in Crete. Then the smaller military oilers take it from the hub to the carrier. Then the carrier pumps it into the jets. And if the jets are doing a long-range mission, they meet a KC-135 or a KC-46 tanker in the air. That tanker itself had to take off from a base like in Sirlik in Turkey or Al Udeid in Qatar. Every gallon of fuel burned by a reconnaissance plane might have been handled by 6 different vehicles and traveled 4,000 miles before it reached the engine.
It makes me think about the specialized assets Daniel mentioned, like the Boeing Growlers. For those who don't know, the Growler is the electronic warfare version of the Super Hornet. Its job is basically to scream so loud electronically that the enemy's radar and communications go deaf. That sounds like it would require a lot of power, and therefore a lot of fuel.
It does. The ALQ-99 jamming pods on a Growler actually have their own little ram air turbines on the nose to generate the electricity they need because the plane's own generators can't keep up with the demand. And more importantly, it requires a very specific type of maintenance. A Growler is packed with incredibly sensitive electronics. Those things don't like heat, and they don't like being vibrated for 20 hours straight. So when Daniel talks about moving Growlers to a base in Spain, he's not just talking about the planes. He's talking about the Iron Mountain, the shipping containers full of spare parts, the specialized technicians who know how to fix a jamming pod, and the secure data links needed to update the threat libraries on those planes.
That is an important point. Logistics isn't just fuel and bullets, it's information. If a new radar signature pops up in the region, that Growler needs to know how to jam it. That update has to come from a center in the United States, go through a satellite, down to the base in Spain, and into the plane's computer. That is digital logistics.
It really is the ultimate network in a box. And when the US moves these things into the Mediterranean, they are essentially plugging a new node into a global grid that already exists. They aren't starting from scratch. They are leveraging decades of investment in bases like Rota in Spain or Sigonella in Sicily. These are not just runways, they are massive logistics nodes with deep water ports and huge fuel farms.
You mentioned the KC-46 Pegasus earlier. That's the newer tanker, right? How much of a leap is that over the old KC-135? Does it change the math for how long we can keep things in the air?
It does, but maybe not in the way people think. The KC-46 can carry more fuel and has better defensive systems, but its real advantage is its own connectivity. It can act as a data relay. So while it is refueling a surveillance plane, it is also sucking up data from that plane and beaming it back to headquarters. It turns the gas station into a router. This actually helps with the endurance problem because it allows the surveillance plane to offload its processing. If the plane doesn't have to crunch all the data itself, it saves power and reduces the heat load on its internal systems, which might actually extend the life of the electronics during a long mission.
That is fascinating. So the tanker is actually helping the recon planes stay up longer by taking some of the intellectual load off the machine. But let's go back to the theoretical limit. If we remove the human, and we use a drone like the Global Hawk or the MQ-9 Reaper, what is the record? How long have we actually kept something up?
The Global Hawk is the king of this for the US military. It can stay up for over 34 hours. There was an experimental Airbus drone called the Zephyr, which is solar-powered, that stayed airborne for 64 days straight back in 2022.
64 days? That is incredible. That's 2 months of flying.
It is, but the Zephyr is a very different beast. It's basically a high-altitude glider made of carbon fiber that weighs less than a person. It carries a very light payload and flies way above the weather at 70,000 feet. For a high-performance military asset that needs to carry heavy cameras, radar, and jamming gear, you can't do that with solar power yet. You need the energy density of jet fuel. So for something like a Global Hawk, you are still limited by that engine oil issue we talked about. Even without a pilot, the engine eventually needs a human to walk up to it with a wrench and a fresh quart of oil.
So the dream of a permanent eye in the sky is still a bit of a reach with current atmospheric technology. You eventually have to come down, if only to change the oil. It makes you realize why satellites are so valuable, despite being so much further away. They have the ultimate endurance because they aren't fighting gravity or friction in the same way.
Exactly. But satellites have fixed orbits, or at least predictable ones. If you are an adversary, you know exactly when the satellite is going to be overhead. A surveillance plane can loiter. It can change its angle. It can get under the clouds if it needs to. That flexibility is worth the logistical nightmare of keeping it airborne. And that brings us back to Daniel's point about the expert posture. The reason the US is the only power that can really do this at scale is that they have spent 80 years building the gas stations. If you look at a map of US tanker orbits during a major operation, it looks like a highway system in the sky. There are specific tracks where tankers just circle waiting for customers.
It's like a giant valet service for warplanes. I want to dig into the mobile supply chain for a second. Daniel mentioned moving things to Spain. When you move a squadron like that, what does the actual footprint look like on the ground? We think of the planes, but how many people are behind them?
For a single squadron of 12 to 18 fighter-level aircraft, you are looking at several hundred personnel. You need the maintainers, obviously. But you also need the fuel specialists, the munitions experts even for non-combat roles, the security forces to guard the perimeter, and the communications team. Then you have the life support. You need kitchens, barracks, and medical facilities. This is why the US uses these large hubs like Rota in Spain or Ramstein in Germany. You can't just land a Growler at a civilian airport and expect to keep it running for a month. You need the infrastructure to test the engines, to calibrate the sensors, and to store the classified data.
And that infrastructure has to be fed. I was reading about the C-17 Globemaster missions that happen whenever a carrier strike group moves. They are basically flying spare engines and specialized tools across the Atlantic every day.
The C-17 is the unsung hero of this whole story. It can carry an entire Abrams tank, or it can carry several jet engines. If a carrier in the Mediterranean has a jet with a blown engine and they don't have a spare on board, a C-17 will fly one from a warehouse in the States to a base in Europe, and then a C-2 Greyhound or the newer CM-V-22. B Osprey, which is a specialized cargo plane that can land on a carrier, will fly that engine out to the ship. You can go from a broken engine in the middle of the ocean to a functional aircraft in less than 48 hours. That is the expert logistics Daniel is talking about. It's the ability to project a repair shop across an ocean.
It's a literal bridge of metal and fuel across the planet. It makes me wonder about the cost. Not just the dollar cost, which is obviously in the billions, but the carbon cost and the sheer energy expenditure. To keep one surveillance plane over a target for 24 hours, how much fuel is burned by the support network compared to the plane itself?
That is a great question. Some estimates suggest that for every gallon of fuel burned by a combat or recon aircraft in a remote area, you might be burning 2 or 3 gallons just to get that fuel there. You are burning fuel in the tanker, which is a huge, heavy plane. You are burning fuel in the ships that brought the fuel to the tanker's base. You are burning fuel in the trucks that moved it to the port. It is an incredibly energy-intensive way to project power. It's like a pyramid, where the fighter jet is the tiny capstone at the top and the base is a massive mountain of burning kerosene.
It really puts the amateur's tall tactics quite in perspective. If you are a general, you aren't just thinking about where the Growler is going to fly. You are thinking about the weather in the North Atlantic, because if the tankers can't refuel the cargo planes, the engines don't get to the carrier, and the jets don't fly. Everything is connected. If a dockworkers' strike happens in a port that handles jet fuel, your air superiority in a conflict zone thousands of miles away starts to degrade within a week.
And it's fragile. We saw this during the initial stages of the conflict in Ukraine back in 2022, where the Russian logistics lines were stretched thin. They had the tanks, they had the troops, but they didn't have the expert posture. They didn't have the mobile supply chain to keep those assets moving once they were more than 80 miles from their own border. They were literally running out of gas on the highway. The US has spent decades ensuring they don't have that problem, even if they are 8,000 miles from home. They have mastered the art of the floating base and the flying gas station.
So, to summarize the answer to Daniel's first question, the theoretical limit for a manned aircraft is probably around 40 to 50 hours before the crew becomes a liability. For the machine itself, it's probably a few hundred hours before the oil or a critical mechanical component fails. Even with infinite fuel, you eventually hit a wall of physics and biology.
Well said. And for the second part, the logistics of the refueling assets, it is a nested doll of supply chains. Each tanker depends on a base. Each base depends on a ship or a pipeline, and each of those depends on a global network of refineries and warehouses. It is the most complex machine ever built, and it's mostly invisible until you see it all moving at once like we are seeing now in the Mediterranean.
It's a sobering thought, really. The sheer amount of human effort and resources required to keep a single camera or a single jammer in the sky. It makes you realize that air power isn't about the planes. It's about the pipes. It's about the flow of material.
Exactly. If you want to win a war, you don't look at the fighter pilots. You look at the guys driving the oil tankers and the mechanics changing the filters. They are the ones who actually determine how long the expert posture can be maintained. If they stop, the whole machine grinds to a halt in 48 hours.
So what are the practical takeaways for our listeners? If they are watching the news or looking at flight trackers like Flight Radar, 24 or ADSB Exchange, what should they be looking for to see if this logistics machine is actually working?
Look for the tankers. On flight tracking apps, look for planes with call signs like Nectar or Roma or Quid. Those are often tankers. If you see them flying in neat, oval-shaped orbits over the Mediterranean or the North Sea, you know there is a significant operation happening nearby. They are the heartbeat of the mission. Also, look at the transit of cargo planes. If you see a steady stream of C-17s and C-5s moving from the U.S. East Coast toward Europe and the Middle East, that is the supply chain being primed. That is the real indicator of how long the U.S. intends to stay in the region. You don't move that much gear if you're only staying for a weekend.
That is a great tip. It's like watching the blood flow to the muscles before they start moving. And I think it's also a reminder for all of us in our own lives and businesses. We often focus on the tactics, the big presentation, the new product launch, the flashy result. But without the logistics, the sleep, the preparation, the underlying systems, those big moments are unsustainable. You can't stay at 30,000 feet forever if you don't have a plan for the oil change.
I love that. We all need a personal tanker every now and then to keep us airborne, and maybe a better way to handle our own piddle packs.
Definitely. Well, I think we have covered the limits of flight and the madness of military logistics for today. Daniel, thanks for that prompt. It really forced us to look under the hood of what power projection actually means in the 21st century. It's not just about the loud noises and the fast jets. It's about the quiet, steady flow of oil and information.
It was a blast. I could talk about jet engine oil and hydraulic viscosity for another hour, but I think the audience might appreciate it if I didn't.
Probably for the best. Before we head out, I want to remind everyone that if you are enjoying these deep dives into the weird and the technical, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other curious minds find the show, and we love reading your feedback. It's our own form of logistics. It keeps the show running.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference. And if you have your own weird prompts or questions about how the world works, whether it's about military tech, biology, or the secret history of the post office, you can always reach us.
You can find all our past episodes, our category taxonomy, and a contact form at myweirdprompts.com. We also have an RSS feed there for the subscribers. If you want to email us directly, you can reach the show at myweirdprompts.com.
We are also available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you usually get your audio fix.
Thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. We will be back soon with more explorations of the prompts you send our way.
Until next time, keep your logistics tight and your curiosity flying high.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.